thus extending our researches, we shall be able to suit every constitution and every pocket, every whim and fancy that the most extravagant sensualist can desire. Here may they learn to shun the dreadful quicksands of pain and mortification, and land safe on the terra firma of delight and love.
That was the opening to Harris's book of Covent-Garden Ladies. However, before we look into the publication and how it became so infamous, we must first ask the question of what London and the situation for prostitutes in London was like in the mid-18th century.
London was in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which meant that there was a high rural to urban migration pattern as people flocked to major cities, such as London, to find jobs. This brought women who were from rural backgrounds and lacked education to the capital, many of whom struggled to find employment due to competition. The workforce was dominated by men, as demonstrated in an article that the Times ran in 1786, saying, "We have men mantua makers, men milliners, men staymakers, men shoemakers for women's shoes. Such are some of the many causes to which we owe that awful excess of female prostitution." Furthermore, when women did find employment, it was often insecure. A vast amount of the clothing industry in which women were employed collapsed and was culpable for the redundancy of their job, forcing many women to turn to prostitution. Prominent 18th century historian Tony Henderson notes that the majority of those women in prostitution were from the poorest parts of society and lacked the skills that allowed them to escape a life of poverty. He goes on to say that the death or the desertion of one or both parents was a contributing factor for those who ended up working as prostitutes, as they lacked the financial stability that parents could provide. Therefore, most of the women who began prostitution at this time were young, unskilled girls who often lacked families and who entered into the trade in their late teens and early 20s, but left the streets after a few years once they had earned enough money to be able to leave the business.
In 1757, the first list is published, but what exactly was this pocketbook? How did it come to be, and how did it become so notorious?
So the Covent Garden we're talking about is the Covent Garden that was styled by Inigo Jones, a late Tudor Earl of Stuart architect. He had been commissioned to build many homes around Covent Garden. But by the 18th century, the area had fallen into disrepair, so brothels, free houses, taverns and coffee houses are all moving into the area, and it becomes a notorious area for crime and prostitution. Now, the list we're talking about was compiled by a man called Samuel Derrick. He was born in Dublin, and he came to London to try his hand at acting, but had failed. So then he decided to try his hand at writing, which also wasn't going well for him. Derrick was living in an area known as Grub Street. This was a district of impoverished writers, poets and actors and booksellers all trying to make it to the top. This is now what we would call the Barbican Estate. Lodging in Covent Garden, he associated with the chief waiter at the Shakespeare's Head. Now, the Shakespeare Head's Tavern is in the northeast corner of Covent Garden Square. Today, if you go there, you might find Paper Chase, the entrance to the Royal Opera House and the Mulberry Store. But at the time, it was one of the most notorious places for prostitutes to summon customers. Now, the chief waiter at the Shakespeare's Head Tavern is a man named Jack Harris, or Jack Harrison. And he kept a list of women who might be appropriate for his clients' needs, who would pop in and out on business. The unpublished list became notorious in the area, and Harris became known as the Pimp General of all of London, so already lots of men are aware of this list. Now, Jack Harris is a bit of a savvy businessman and decides to cut a deal with Derrick. So by 1757, Samuel Derrick leaves prison after serving a sentence for debt and decides to pen a guide based on the list that Jack keeps. It took the form of a small pocketbook of about 150 pages and was normally priced at 2 shillings a sixpence, so marketed for kind of the upper working class and middle classes. Derrick, at some point in his agreement with Jack Harris, decides he won't attribute the name to the works, and it's highly likely it's because he was attempting to climb the social ladder, but also be recognised as a legitimate writer. So the list was actually a moneymaker for Derrick in an attempt to kind of fund his more serious adventures in writing. It did sort of work for a while, but he died penniless despite becoming Master of Ceremonies in Bath and Tunbridge Wells.
So, what was the reaction to Harris's list?
So the immediate reaction to the book is quite big. In 1758, Harris had become a bit of a man about town. but this proved to be his undoing, and the authorities tried to crack down on the whole trade. And the Shakespeare's Head Tavern was raided, with Harris taken as a prisoner to Newgate, where he remained for a few years. And then when he was released, he went on to run a few other pubs. The tavern closed in 1804, and the empty premises were badly damaged by the Covent Garden theatre fire. Lucy Inglis has described the list as instant success, and it ran for 38 yearly editions from 1757. It was advertised on the front of newspapers in London, so actually it's quite a popular mainstream book. It's not some kind of niche market. It's estimated that over 8,000 copies were sold each year at its height, and 250,000 was estimated to have been sold in total. Just to put that into some context, Bridget Jones has sold 15 million, and that's at a time when the book trade today is worldwide, literally, as there's so many more English speakers as there would have been in Georgian London. It's kind of remarkable for a book with such limited geographical focus and interest. Sadly, in 1769, Derek dies, and we're not sure who writes it each year from that point. And from also that point, the editions become cruder, kind of losing the innocent humour that the list was originally famous for.
So, having looked at the list beginning, how was the booklet structured?
Well, for starters, the vowels were removed from the prostitute's surname to keep her true identity a secret. A small poem started the advertisement and was followed by a description, price and location. The majority of the girls tended to be young, although not exclusively. Some were regular features in the list, while others would appear and reappear as they found other employment. Some even had clientele of important stature, such as actors and members of Parliament. Geographically, they were spread out through London, but were primarily focused to the north-east of Covent-Garden, around Regent Street, Oxford Street, Tottenham Court Road, Russell Square and Soho. Historian Matthew Sangster has used Richard Norwood's Plan of London to map the 93 entries from the 1788 edition of the list, which you can see by looking at the link in the podcast description. London differs from prostitution in other European cities because London's prostitutes mostly worked upon the streets and not in brothels like the girls in Paris, New York and even Edinburgh, a city that had a guide like Harris's, which instead organised the women by brothel houses. The list gives a range of descriptions of the prostitutes, the most common being based on her sexual prowess and lustfulness, but the list also acknowledges financial struggle and greed in the description of the prostitutes. This is interesting as the list is first and foremost an erotic publication and not a social commentary. Therefore, the list is a great tool for historians to study perception and attitudes towards prostitution from the average Londoner at the time.
Therefore, what would be a typical entry in Harris's list?
Mrs. Dodd, number 6 Hind Court, Fleet Street. This lady appeared some years ago to our readers under the name of Oglesby or Oglestree, but as we have frequently seen, that a girl, though young, may yet be very disagreeable, so we may conclude, from Mrs. Dodd, that a woman in years may be perfectly alluring. She is, indeed, turned of 40, rather fat and short. If discipline forms the soldier in the wars of Mars, experience finishes the female combatant in the skirmishes of Venus. That experience this lady has, and is perfectly skilled in every delightful manoeuvre, knowing how to keep time, when to advance and retreat, to face to the right or left, and when to shower down a whole volley of love, so that those who are vanquished by her glory in their defeat pant only for returning vigour to renew the combat. She is perfectly mistress in the art of restoring life, and performs the tender friction with a hand soft as turtle's down. Keeps the house, and after giving you a whole night's of entertainment, is perfectly satisfied, and will give you a comfortable cup of tea in the morning for £1.1.
So that was Mrs. Dodd of Fleet Street in the 1785 edition, and the address given in the book can actually still be located to somewhere today, and the alleyway that she resided down still exists, and it's nestled between a Starbucks and a Ryman stationery store. And what we see from the description is that ladies can be of all ages. She's 40, Mrs. Dodd. They're all of all shapes and sizes. Mrs. Dodd is rather fat and short, but she's by no means a typical example. The description we see, there's a lot of metaphor, subtle not even subtle innuendo, quite blasé innuendo, and it's quite humorous. And but what we take away from that as historians is that we see that ladies are dipping in and out of the profession of prostitution, and this most likely happens as they try to supplement their incomes when times are especially hard. Some of the innuendo and metaphor that we see adds humour to it. So when the description says she would shower down a whole volley of love, so that those who are vanquished by her glory in their defeat, pant only for returning vigour to renew the combat. And also the fact that she'll give you a whole night's entertainment until you're perfectly satisfied. And just that line at the end where it says, she'll give you a comfortable cup of tea in the morning. It's probably this humour that made the list so popular. It's almost like a satire. One might quite happily read the descriptions for entertainment purposes alone, even if you're not interested in using a prostitute.
Miss Harriet Lloyd, Toy Shop, Jermyn Street. This pretty little smart girl, this true lover of the sport, is at present in keeping a Member of Parliament not far from St. James's, but not being sufficiently membered for her lower house, she appropriates the greatest part of the member's hard coin to support and keep in good humour two favourites of her own. She is now only 17. Her dark eyes have much lustre and more meaning. Her limbs, though small, are well shaped, covered with a skin fair as the swan's neck and soft as its down. They are perfectly pliable and form 1,000 true lovers' knots, first to facilitate the entrance into her apartment, and then to keep the enraptured lodger there as long as possible. Indeed, she never lets one depart till he has paid his rent, but to show she is not avaricious, she generally returns as much as she receives.
What we see from the example of Mrs. Lloyd is probably the darker side to the story. I mean, she's still very young, she's only 16, but it also shows that all manner of people were using prostitutes. Mrs. Lloyd keeps present a Member of Parliament, but it also shows that for some of the ladies this was a reliable and large source of income for them. Jermyn Street is actually a street now known for being aimed exclusively at the men's clothing market, but at the time would have been home to men like the Duke of Marlborough and then Isaac Newton. What's kind of ironic is the fact that Mrs. Lloyd can be found above a toy shop. There's that kind of weird seediness that us today would find it difficult to understand, that children could go into the toy shop, but then men could go upstairs to a different toy shop.
Despite the rather comical and blasé demeanour that the list takes, does it actually reflect the realities of the London prostitutes?
Based on Old Bailey court trials from the period, and the research by Lucy Inglis, we know that prostitutes were occasionally mistreated by their clients and by the general public, who saw them as sexual objects which they were free to abuse. One such story is of Anne Bell, who was attacked by a customer and died from infection. The accuser was never convicted, as the man was rumoured to have paid off the courts. Furthermore, Anne's job meant she was not seen favourably to the jury, nor to society in general. All in all, the Times newspaper estimated that in 1785 that 5,000 prostitutes in London died from assorted causes such as assault and murder. Despite the openness and tolerant attitude that the list displays, it does not reflect the general attitudes towards the sex trade in the 18th century. The prostitution industry in Georgian London faced much opposition, particularly at the beginning of the century, from the Society for the Reformation of Manners, founded in 1691. Another group that opposed prostitution was the Church. However, within the Church, attitudes were often divided between those who wanted to abolish the sex trade and those who believed that it played an essential part within Christian society. Many used the work of St. Augustine to prove that prostitution was a necessary evil, as men might turn to sodomy and the corruption of respectable women if the opportunity to pay for sex with a woman wasn't readily available.
It is clear that this list was immensely popular in its time, so why did it go out of fashion?
So after the death of Samuel Derrick, by the 1780s, the list was being printed by three different men in London, brothers John and James Roach and John Atkin, and some were being fined for publishing it. In fact, John Roach was imprisoned. The Proclamation Society brought him to court for libel, and the Chief Justice convicted him knowing that Roach had been responsible for previous editions of the list, despite the fact he had never been convicted before. So what we're seeing is the authorities and moral groups are getting together to kind of stamp out and force these men over to the side. But by this point, public opinion was also generally starting to turn against the sex trade as reformers continuously petitioned the authorities to do something about it. And perhaps this could be seen as the start of the sort of strict Victorian and later Georgian straitjacket attitudes we are so familiar with. So in 1795, many of the people known to be involved with the list were fined and imprisoned. And in that year, that was the last edition of the list.
Thus, Harris's list is essential to our understanding on the conflicting Georgian attitudes towards prostitution. Although it represented the contemporary opinion surrounding the selling of sex, due to the emerging Victorian views on both sex and prostitution, it was to have little impact after it went out of production in 1795. Despite this, it is a vital tool for historians to further understand the differing values on the sex trade in Georgian London. Thank you for listening.